all right, I'll read more. Foggier, yet colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. If the good Saint Dunstan had but nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapons, then indeed he would have roared to lusty purpose. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hunger cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of "God bless ye, merry gentlemen, by nothing you dismay," Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived, with an ill-will Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tactily admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop a half-a-crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." The clerk smiled faintly, and yet Scrooge... "Oh, and yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day wages for no work." The clerk observed that it only once a year, a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December, said Scrooge, buttoning his great coat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no great coat, went down a slide, hung Cornhill at the end of the lane of boys, and 20 times, in honor of it being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play blind man's bluff. Blind man's bluff. That's what I'm saying. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in his chambers, which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were gloomy, sweet rooms in a lowering pile of burning up yard, where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide and seek with other houses and forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now and dreary enough nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope it with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. Now, it's a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except it was very large. And it was also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during the whole residence in that place. And also that Scrooge had as little of what in this place, what is called a fancy about him, as any man in the city is called London, even including, which is a bold word, that corporation, alderman, and livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key and locking the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not an impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look at Scrooge, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That and its livid color made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key that had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, lit his candle. He did pause with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door, except there was the screws and the nuts that held the knocker on. But he said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed it with a bang. The sound resonated through the house like thunder. Every room above, every cask in the wine merchant cellars below, appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, and slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and 6 up good old flight of stairs, or through a bad young act of parliament, but I mean to say, you might have got the hearse up the staircase and taken it up broadwise with the splinter bar towards the wall and the door and bladder raised and done it too easy. There was plenty of width for that, and room to spare, which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out in the street wouldn't have lighted up the entry too well, so you may suppose it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Up Scrooge went, not carrying a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut up his heavy door, he walked through the rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, nobody in the fireplace, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and a little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head. Upon the hob, nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual, old fire guards, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed the door and locked himself in, double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus, secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers, and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit next to it and brood over it before he could extract the last sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all around with quaint Dutch tiles designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers, descending through the air on clouds like feather beds, Abrahams, Bezalhazers, apostles, putting off to sea in butterboats, hundreds of figures attract his thoughts, and yet the face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like an ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up whole. If each smooth tile had been a blanket first with power to shape some pictured surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every single one. "Humbug!" said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again as he threw his head back in the chair. His glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room, communicated for some purpose, now for some gotten with some chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but it soon rang loudly, and so did every other bell in the house. This might have lasted for a minute, half a minute, but it seemed like an hour. The bells ceased as they begun together, and they succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a very heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, and then coming up the stairs, and then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up, as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again. The very same face, The same face. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels on the leather bristling like his pigtail, and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, and he never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and through and saw it stand before him, though he felt the chilling influence of his death's cold eyes, and marked the varying texture of the folded kerchief found about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before. He was still incredulous, and fought against his own senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much!" Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say to a shade, but situated this is more appropriate. "In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair. He felt that in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe me?" observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "What? Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats, and you may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than a grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be as smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror for the specter's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To sit staring at those fixed, glazed eyes in silence for a moment would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the specter's being provided the infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were all still agitated by the hot vapor from the oven.